The forest was alive, but not in the way most people imagined. It wasn't the cheerful chirping of birds or the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze. This forest hummed with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, a whisper that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It was a sound that only those who truly listened could hear, a sound that carried warnings, secrets, and the weight of centuries. The arrival. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dense canopy of Redwood National Park. A man, rugged and weathered, moved slowly through the underbrush. His name was Elias, a retired park ranger who had spent decades in these woods. He knew every trail, every stream, and every grove of ancient trees. But tonight, the forest felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more profound. Even the usual chorus of crickets and owls was absent. Elias had come back to the forest after years of staying away. He carried a backpack filled with supplies, a rifle slung over his shoulder, and a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with the gear. He had received a letter, unsigned, with only a single sentence: "The forest remembers." It was enough to pull him back into the wilderness he had tried to forget. The whisper. As Elias ventured deeper, the forest seemed to close in around him. The towering redwoods loomed like silent sentinels, their bark rough and ancient, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was soft beneath his boots, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling his nostrils. He paused, listening. There it was again. The whisper. It wasn't a sound he could pinpoint. It was everywhere and nowhere, a faint hum that seemed to vibrate in his bones. He shook it off and pressed on, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The light was fading fast, and he needed to find a place to set up camp. But as he walked, he began to notice signs of disturbance. Claw marks on tree trunks, broken branches, and tufts of fur caught on thorns. Something large had passed through here recently. The presence. Elias found a small clearing and began to set up his tent. The forest was eerily quiet now, the only sound the crunch of leaves under his boots. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He scanned the trees, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle at his side. Nothing. Just shadows and the faint glow of the moon filtering through the canopy. But then he saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. They were low to the ground, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. A black bear. It was massive, its fur glistening in the moonlight, its breath visible in the cold night air. Elias froze, his heart pounding. He knew better than to make sudden movements. The bear stared at him for what felt like an eternity before turning and disappearing into the trees. The tension. Elias didn't sleep that night. Every sound, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, set his nerves on edge. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as if the forest itself was trying to tell him something. He thought about the letter, about the bear, about the strange feeling that had settled over him since he arrived. The forest remembered. But what did it remember? At dawn, he packed up his camp and continued deeper into the woods. The trail was harder to follow now, overgrown and barely visible. He relied on instinct, on the faint memory of paths he had walked years ago. The whisper was constant now, a low hum that seemed to guide him forward. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to keep moving. The twist. By midday, Elias reached a place he hadn't seen in decades. A hidden grove, untouched by time. The trees here were even larger, their trunks so wide it would take a dozen men to encircle them. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp wood. And there, in the center of the grove, was a massive black bear. It was the same one he had seen the night before, but now it was lying on the ground, its breathing labored, its fur matted with blood. Elias approached cautiously, his rifle raised, but as he got closer, he realized the bear wasn't alone. Beside it was a cub, small and trembling, its eyes wide with fear. The mother bear looked at Elias, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no aggression, no threat, only a deep, unspoken understanding. The bear was dying, and it was asking him to protect its cub. The climax. Elias lowered his rifle and knelt beside the bear. He could see the wound now, a deep gash in its side, likely from a poacher's trap. The forest whispered louder, the hum now a roar in his ears. He felt a surge of emotion, a mix of anger, sorrow, and guilt. He had spent his life protecting this forest, but he had also failed it in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. The bear let out a low groan, its body shuddering as it took its last breath. The cub whimpered, nuzzling against its mother. Elias reached out, his hand trembling, and gently touched the cub's fur. It was soft, warm, alive. He knew what he had to do. The resolution. Elias buried the mother bear beneath a pile of stones, marking the grave with a single redwood branch. The cub stayed close, its fear slowly giving way to trust. As they left the grove, the whisper faded, replaced by the sounds of the forest coming back to life, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an eagle. Elias didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't leave the forest again. It had called him back for a reason, and he would answer. The cub trotted beside him, a silent reminder of the life he had sworn to protect. Together, they disappeared into the trees, the forest's whisper now a quiet, steady hum in the background. The story ends with Elias and the cub vanishing into the depths of the forest, leaving the audience with a sense of mystery and wonder. The forest's whisper lingers, a reminder that nature holds secrets we may never fully understand, and that sometimes the only way to find peace is to listen. Elias and the cub moved through the forest with a quiet understanding. The cub, still unsteady on its feet, stayed close to Elias, its small body brushing against his legs as they walked. The forest seemed to welcome them, the trees parting slightly to let them pass, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden streaks. The whisper had faded, but Elias could still feel its presence, a gentle hum in the back of his mind, guiding him forward. He didn't know where they were going, but he trusted the forest. It had brought him here for a reason, and he was determined to see it through. The cub, now his responsibility, was a living reminder of the life he had sworn to protect. He couldn't fail again. The encounter. As they walked, Elias began to notice signs of human activity, broken branches, discarded trash, and the faint smell of smoke. His heart sank. Poachers. They were still out there, still threatening the delicate balance of the forest. He tightened his grip on his rifle and moved cautiously, the cub following close behind. The signs led them to a small clearing, where a makeshift camp had been set up. There were tents, a fire pit, and crates filled with traps and tools. Elias's stomach churned as he realized what they were doing. These men weren't just hunting for food. They were after trophies, pelts, and anything else they could sell. The forest was under siege, and Elias was the only one who could stop it. The confrontation. Elias left the cub hidden in the underbrush and approached the camp. He moved silently, his years of training as a ranger kicking in. The men were gathered around the fire, laughing and drinking, oblivious to the danger approaching them. Elias counted 3 of them, all armed, all dangerous. He took a deep breath and stepped into the clearing, his rifle raised. The men froze, their laughter dying in their throats. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the men reached for his gun, and Elias fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the forest, startling birds into flight. "Leave," Elias said, his voice steady but filled with authority. "Leave now, and don't come back." The men hesitated, their eyes darting between Elias and their weapons. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his face, sneered. "This isn't your forest anymore, old man. You can't stop us." The tension in the clearing was palpable. The men were outnumbered, but they were armed and desperate. Elias knew he couldn't take them all on his own, but he also knew he couldn't back down. The forest was counting on him. The scarred man took a step forward, his hand hovering over his gun. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle. "The only mistake I made was letting men like you think you could get away with this." Before the man could respond, a low growl echoed through the clearing. The men turned. The low growl grew louder, reverberating through the clearing like a warning. The men froze, their eyes darting toward the edge of the forest. From the shadows emerged the black bear cub, its small body tense, its eyes fixed on the intruders. Behind it, the underbrush rustled, and then, with a sudden burst of movement, a massive black bear stepped into the clearing. It was not the cub's mother. This bear was larger, its fur darker, its presence commanding. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Elias's heart raced. He had never seen a bear of this size before. It moved with a deliberate grace, its eyes locked on the poachers. The men stumbled backward, their bravado evaporating. The scarred man dropped his gun, his hands raised in surrender. "We're leaving," he stammered. "We're leaving." The bear let out a deafening roar, its teeth bared, its claws digging into the earth. The men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled to gather their belongings, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. Within moments, they were gone, their camp abandoned, their threats empty. The guardian. Elias stood, frozen, his rifle still raised, but his finger off the trigger. The bear turned its gaze toward him, and for a moment he felt a surge of fear. But the bear didn't attack. It simply stared at him, its eyes deep and knowing, as if it recognized him. Then, with a low grunt, it turned and disappeared into the forest, the cub trotting after it. Elias lowered his rifle, his hands trembling. He felt a strange mix of relief and awe. The forest had protected itself, using him as a conduit, a messenger. He had come back to face his past, but instead, he had been shown the future. A future where the forest and its inhabitants could thrive, if only given the chance. As Elias made his way back to the cub, he noticed something glinting in the firelight. It was a small, weathered journal, left behind by one of the poachers. He picked it up and flipped through the pages. The entries were sparse, but they told a story of greed, of men who saw the forest as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. But there was something else, too. A map, marked with locations deep within the forest, places Elias had never ventured. One location was circled repeatedly with a single word scrawled beside it: sanctuary. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He had heard rumors of a hidden sanctuary, a place where the oldest and largest redwoods stood, untouched by time. It was said to be protected by the forest itself, a place where only the worthy could enter. The poachers had been searching for it, but they had failed. And now Elias had the map. With the cub by his side, Elias set off toward the marked location. The forest seemed to guide him, the whisper returning, soft and steady, like a heartbeat. The journey was arduous, the terrain rugged and unforgiving, but Elias pressed on. He felt a sense of purpose, a connection to the forest that he had never felt before. As they traveled, the cub grew stronger, its movements more confident. It seemed to sense the importance of their mission, its eyes bright with curiosity and determination. Together they crossed rivers, climbed steep ridges, and navigated dense thickets, the forest growing quieter and more still with each step. Finally, they reached the sanctuary. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a grove of redwoods so massive they seemed to touch the sky. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, the ground carpeted with soft moss. In the center of the grove stood the largest tree Elias had ever seen, its trunk wide enough to dwarf a house, its branches stretching out like the arms of a giant. Elias approached the tree, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch its bark. It was warm, almost alive, pulsing with a quiet energy. The cub sat at his feet, its eyes wide with wonder. The whisper was gone now, replaced by a profound silence, a sense of peace that filled Elias's soul. Legacy. Elias knew he had found what he was meant to find. The sanctuary was real, and it was his duty to protect it. He would spend the rest of his days guarding this place, ensuring that it remained untouched, a refuge for the forest and its inhabitants. The cub would grow strong here, free from the threats of poachers and the encroachment of civilization. As the sun set, casting the grove in a golden light, Elias sat beneath the great tree, the cub curled up beside him. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a connection to the forest that went beyond words. The forest had whispered to him, and he had listened. Now, he would ensure that its voice would never be silenced. The whispers end. The story ends with Elias and the cub resting beneath the ancient redwood, the forest around them alive with the sounds of nature. The whisper is gone, but its message remains, a reminder that the forest is more than just trees and animals. It is a living, breathing entity, a guardian of secrets and a keeper of balance. And Elias, once a man haunted by his past, has found his place within it, a protector of the wild, a steward of the earth. The audience is left with a sense of awe and reverence, a reminder of the power and mystery of the natural world. The forest's whisper lingers in their minds, a call to listen, to protect, and to remember. As the days turned into weeks, Elias and the cub settled into a rhythm within the sanctuary. The grove became their home, a place of safety and solitude. Elias spent his days exploring the area, mapping its hidden trails and documenting the flora and fauna. He found himself in awe of the sanctuary's untouched beauty, the way the sunlight filtered through the towering redwoods, the way the air seemed to hum with life. The cub, now growing stronger and more independent, followed him everywhere, its playful antics a constant source of joy. But Elias knew their peace was fragile. The poachers had been driven away, but they would return. The sanctuary's existence was no longer a secret, and Elias had to prepare. He began fortifying the grove, setting up traps and alarms to deter intruders. He also reached out to a few trusted contacts from his ranger days, men and women who shared his passion for conservation. Slowly, a network of allies began to form, all dedicated to protecting the sanctuary. The threat returns. One evening, as Elias sat by the fire, the cub suddenly stiffened, its ears twitching. Elias froze, listening. The forest was silent, too silent. Then he heard it, the faint snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Someone was out there. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the edge of the clearing, the cub close behind. Through the trees, he saw shadows moving, their shapes distorted by the fading light. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen, armed and determined. They had come for the sanctuary, and they weren't leaving without it. Elias's heart pounded as he weighed his options. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he couldn't let them win. The sanctuary was too important, too sacred. He turned to the cub, his voice low and urgent. "Stay here," he whispered. "No matter what happens, stay hidden." The cub whined softly but obeyed, retreating into the shadows. Elias took a deep breath and stepped into the open, his rifle raised. "This is your last warning," he called out, his voice steady. "Leave now, or face the consequences." The men laughed, their voices harsh and mocking. "You're one man," the scarred leader sneered. "What are you going to do, old-timer? Shoot us all?" Elias didn't respond. He simply stood his ground, his eyes locked on the leader. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick and suffocating. The forest rises. Just as the men began to advance, a low rumble echoed through the grove. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the trees seemed to sway unnaturally. The men froze, their bravado faltering. From the shadows emerged not one, but several black bears, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They moved with a purpose, their massive forms blocking the path to the sanctuary. Elias felt a surge of hope. The forest was fighting back, its guardians rising to defend it. The bears let out a collective roar, the sound shaking the very air. The men stumbled backward, their weapons slipping from their hands. Even the scarred leader looked terrified, his face pale and drawn. "Run!" one of the men shouted, and they did, scattering into the forest like leaves in the wind. The bears didn't give chase. They simply stood their ground, their presence enough to drive the intruders away. Elias lowered his rifle, his hands trembling. He turned to the bears, his heart filled with gratitude. The largest bear, the one who had saved him before, stepped forward, its eyes meeting his. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Then the bear turned and disappeared into the trees, the others following. The cub emerged from the shadows, its eyes wide with wonder. Elias knelt down and placed a hand on its head, his voice soft. "We're not alone," he said. "The forest is with us. The legacy lives on."